I share this stage with both tall and great scholars, which is both cool and intimidating and inconvenient, but we can deal with all of that. It's a very dramatic title, I apologize, it's not Halloween season anymore. Basically, we're trying to focus on one specific rhetorical device that might be considered part of illiberal rhetoric, which is in our case outgroup rhetoric, which we know from populism studies, etc., that right-wing parties do like to use that. And then, of course, in general, parties use outgroup rhetorics. They don't like all of the people, or at least some parties do not like all of the people in the populace, and they like to tell you which ones they do not like. This, I think, matters, of course, for our attention, for scholarly attention, because negative rhetoric, demonizing rhetoric, of course, has negative social consequences for people who follow these parties and, negative public discourse. And we particularly link it to Joel's conceptualization of illiberalism. We think that this links particularly to two aspects. One, the neutral state, because the neutral state should not have distributive preferences. And outgroup rhetoric in party manifestos, which we are studying, could often mean, that you're proposing, for example, yes, we want to have social benefits only for groups A and B, but not for group X. So this could mean distributive preferences and not treating all groups equal in society. And of course, the liberal society should also actually express tolerance and universal respect for all majority and minority groups in society, and should not have statements like, there's too many people of group X that have come into our country, or they are damaging social cohesion, etc., etc. And we think then there's a link between, this is why we should look at outgroup rhetoric as one particular aspect which we might connect to illiberal rhetoric. And then the question kind of is, our attempt here is a bit of a systematization. First basic question is, do actually, parties, we're using nationalistic parties here just because of the difficulty with, available classifications of parties into party families. So we're using nationalistic and radical right parties here as a bad proxy, and I'm happy to be attacked for that, for illiberal parties. And then the second question is, of course, this parties listen to each other, like political scholars also do. And if somebody says something in the room to you and you do not appear to listen, that might be seen as rude by the other person. Same thing applies to political parties as well. So we know that political parties respond to each other. There's work in AUTHLIB even, that has considered the transnational links between political parties. Parties do not talk in isolation, also not just in national borders. And so we're also trying to take a European context into account and see how trends are shaping out. If the Austrian FPÖ is changing or is successful with some kind of tactic, very likely the AfD in Germany will pay attention and will be interested in what they're doing there. Basically translating that into hypotheses, basically just, we think that radical right parties should mention outgroups more frequently and more negatively than other parties. This is, I think, one of the least interesting hypotheses I have ever presented at a political science audience. Then we think, is there something unique about right-wing parties? Maybe right-wing parties hate these particular outgroups so much that they are more stable. Whatever else happens in the political context, they are so committed to disliking them and mentioning them that whatever else goes on around them, they are more stable in mentioning them more frequently. And they're also less influenced. Whatever else kind of trends are going on there, they're kind of stuck in an ideological framework where they just keep on disliking certain outgroups. And then lastly, we're reducing the data set just to a European context. And we think it's a basic approximation, but we think that building rolling averages, European parties in Europe should be influenced by whatever else is happening in Europe. To do that mostly systematically, we're taking data from the Manifesto project. That means we cover around 50 countries. Of course, most of these are in Europe, but we actually managed to cover at least some continents beyond Europe as well. We have roughly 600 parties in there. The Manifesto project by now provides English translation, machine translations, but very well-validated machine translations, which is a cool resource for. We're getting more multilingual text analysis tools, but not all of them are yet there. So this is very helpful if you have good text analysis tools that are not yet covering all of the languages that you wish to study. We're applying existing tools from other researchers. we have a manifesto, we break it up into sentences. How do we find out groups? A, we need to find any reference to any kind of group. So if we have the sentence, we need to spend more money on group X, then we need to identify that group X actually is a social group references, and we need to distinguish that from the sentence, we need to give more money to nature conservation. Nature conservation is not a social group. Then we need to actually make sense of these. Pensioners are not the same people as men, are not the same people as children. Very obvious fact to us. We actually also need machines to understand that fact and classify them into groups. Those are two models built by Will Hohen and Alona Dolinsky and Lena Huber. And then actually we need to, of course, consider, is the stance expressed here towards that group positive or negative? Are we supporting more? Is the party advocating we should do more for a particular group, or are they advocating this particular group is either a strain on society or we should do less for that particular group? And then we have a manifesto level variable of how often this group is mentioned relative to the length of the manifestos, because some parties are very verbose. And then how often is that party, how often this group is mentioned, how often it is negatively mentioned. We're doing multi-level regressions and with intercepts for the group, the election year, and parties nested within countries. The only fixed effects I have here are for the transitions in the slides that are not happening. Yeah. Thank you. And then we try to select, outgroups. This is a bit of a, as always, this is a meeting of the minds of what can we do empirically and what would we like to do theoretically. This is a deductive classifier, so we have only, certain categories that we can distinguish. So we're focusing on these categories here that have been looked at in previous qualitative studies or single case studies, and we think we can make an argument that these are kind of the common outgroups that we would expect if we look at radical right parties. So criminals, there's punitive populism, we should be harsher to criminals and should have longer sentences for them. LGBTQI people, I think we've discussed that already, same for migrants and ethnic minorities. Elites, a classic target of, I think, populist rhetoric, and then, of course, religious groups, which is one of the limitations here, that we are not distinguishing particular religious groups, and that means we're sadly lumping together Christians and mentions of Christians, Jews, Muslims, etc., where there's room for further improvement. You can probably guess that not all of these were meant to be yellow, but rather in the order of that I wanted to talk about them, but we can improvise that. You can see the tiny red dot, and my tiny red dot will now take you through this. This is standardized coefficients. I'm sorry for the people on stage who can't really see what I'm talking about. Basically, number one, this is the really boring hypothesis. This means the outgroups that I'm looking at, radical right parties mention them both more often and more negatively than other parties. Yay, we've confirmed what we already knew from a lot of studies, but we've just confirmed it in a lot more countries. Cool. Then, very unsurprisingly, parties have some consistency in what they did in the last election. They do that in the same election again. Again, not so surprising. And then we come to maybe to the first interesting thing, which is a null effect. This is the interaction between, is this a radical right party? And it's like manifesto, and we see that there's no specific difference in how radical right parties or other parties, in how stable they are in the salience and the negativity in which they talk about these particular outgroups. So this refutes the second and third hypothesis we had. Then lastly, this is breaking down our data set only into the European ones. We build a rolling average, basically, of all a 5-year rolling average window of all radical right parties in Europe and all the other parties. Again, nationalistic parties mention them more often and more negatively. Again, very non-surprising. We see that nationalistic parties overall don't have an impact on party agenda, which I think makes sense. Nationalistic and radical right parties are only one part of the party spectrum. If we found a big effect here that would call into question, they shouldn't have that much agenda setting power. I think the most interesting part that we get to then are the bottom two things. So this is, again, for any kind of party. We're looking at does the overall European-wide salience and negativity over the last 5 years kind of, how does it shape how this party is writing its manifesto? And we find that nationalistic parties actually do seem to listen to trends that are happening in other European countries. So maybe if there's an election in Portugal and the Portugal radical right parties are talking specifically more about maybe criminals, and then also maybe Austrian parties are doing that in the next year, then it seems that maybe parties in Germany are kind of listening to that, or Finland, and they're seeing kind of trends that it seems to work electorally, and they're kind of picking up similar trends in salience and negativity. And interaction effects always lose me if I don't prepare my script well enough to interpret live on stage. This is also too late in the day. Nationalistic parties listen to other parties. Sorry, they have there's no effect if we're considering the salience, but for the activity, there even seems to be a kind of backlash effect that if other parties are highlighting a group more positively, that actually nationalistic parties are going in the opposite direction. So if the overall party agenda of all the other parties moves in this direction, then nationalistic and radical right parties might actually go in the other direction and not want to follow along with the trend. What does this mean overall for us? We've confirmed a very basic, boring thing that radical right parties mention certain outgroups more negatively and more often than other parties. Mentioning groups, every party seems to have a certain continuity in which groups they talk about and how they talk about them, and radical right parties are not very different here, at least for the outgroups we have considered. So everybody keeps liking or hating these particular groups as much as they did last time, and radical right parties are not more stubborn in that. But we do find in the European context kind of that actually they do seem to be maybe picking up electoral trends that are happening there. Thank you for listening. Yeah.